Okay, so hi everybody and welcome to History Room Live. My name is Jill. I'm the archivist and special collections librarian at Patent Free Library. History Room Live is a weekly Zoom session where we share our collections and resources related to local history and genealogy. Today, our speakers are Tim Richter and Brenda Cummings of Bath Historical Society. Brenda recently took on the role of president, and Tim is the Society's archivist. I want to take this opportunity to thank Bath Historical Society for their support of the History Room through funding, volunteer help, and their efforts to spread the word about this program and other programs that we offer, such as the Winter Town History Series. Recently, Tim and Brenda both participated in a coffee hour discussion about inclusiveness and diversity in local history. And within, I think, about 48 hours after that discussion, I heard from them about this new research into a part of Bath's African American history that we didn't really know a lot about. Black history in this area is something we could all know a lot more about without discounting the work of people like Brenda and Tim, Nancy Levetri, Barry Roderick, and others. I would say that there is much more research to do and many more conversations like this that we can have. So without further ado, I will introduce Brenda and Tim. Take it away.
So I'll start out by telling you how I started telling this story. We're here to tell the story about the First Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment, which was a Maine regiment in the Civil War. And my interest in this topic was prompted many years ago when Robin Haynes told me that there was an African-American soldier from Bath, George Freeman, who had served in the Civil War in the First Maine Heavy Artillery. And I thought that was interesting, and I had been doing some research on African-American families in North Bath and was intrigued by that. But when we finally began researching the First Maine Heavy Artillery and George Freeman, we learned that there was a lot more to the story. I should say at the outset that there's a lot more to the story even after our research. A lot of things that we don't know, and a lot of things that, especially looking back in time, back in history, it's very difficult and sometimes really problematic to assign motives to other people and to people in the past in history, particularly when they don't necessarily share your background and your experience. So since I'm not African American myself, I was very conscious of that in doing this research, that there was a lot of untold stories involved in this presentation. So having said that, I should note that this picture is, as many pictures of African-American soldiers, of any soldiers in the Civil War are, is of an unidentified African-American soldier, and it is not necessarily the First Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment. It is just a soldier guarding a piece of artillery. So it seemed like an appropriate image from the Library of Congress. And Tim, you start.
Okay, so for starters, since we don't want to presume that everybody in the audience might know everything there is to know about the Civil War, we need to give you a little bit of background in Maine's role. So as you can see here, about 72,000 individuals in Maine served as soldiers or sailors. There really is no exact count since it was possible for some people to serve in multiple regiments. It is even documented that some people went from being soldiers to being sailors in the Navy, and I don't think that those numbers count merchant marine or anything of that nature, which in some cases should be counted, in other cases not so much. Keep in mind that Maine in 1860 census had just a hair over 1 million people, and in the last census we just have, we have 1.3 million people. So that number of 72,000 is not insignificant, particularly when you consider the fact that most all of those are obviously males. So out of the half a million male population, that's a pretty significant percentage, actually. Particularly when you then break it down and consider that those are only a certain number of age groups, really. So of those, about 3,500 were killed in action, and another 5,000 or so were lost to disease, which was really the great killer in the Civil War. But again, these numbers are not totally, cast in any kind of stone. When the war began in 1861 and Lincoln makes the first call for troops, he calls for volunteers, and then the states were given quotas based on their population. And then it was left up to the states to decide how to do it by congressional district and then by towns and municipalities. Originally, Maine was only allotted 1 regiment, but then very soon thereafter, when those 90 days are up, Lincoln calls for, I think the next one is 300,000 volunteers. And Maine, like as with many other states, answered the call even in excess of the first quota. So those 72,000 soldiers are represented in 20 infantry regiments, 2 regiments of cavalry, the Heavy Artillery Regiment, an artillery regiment, and then the Navy and sundry other smaller organizations that never left the state that manned some of the forts along the coast and garrisoned other places. Owen's History of Bath, which we all are familiar with, lists about 800 people from the town of Bath serving in the Civil War, which boils down to about 1/10 of our 1860 census population of 8,000 in the town. And again, given that those were all males, or at least all that we know of were males, that's a fairly, significant number of participants in town. And again, that's just the soldiers and sailors. That's not necessarily people on the home front that might have been working in war-related industries, which Maine had quite a bit of. The photo here is a image from the Library of Congress taken by Timothy O'Sullivan, which was one of the handful of photographers walking around at the time in an official capacity. And that's what they call a bomb-proof shelter, which implies that if an artillery shell landed on the roof, you can see the gentleman over on the left of the photo, just kind of the top of his torso, and the other gentleman standing there. The person in the shelter, theoretically, if that was hit by an artillery shell, the roof would hold, theoretically. Depends a lot on what kind of shell it was.
Ready for the next one?
Let's go ahead. Yep.
I'm trying. Hang on. I'm still working on figuring this out. So depending on what source you're looking at, there's either 92 or 104 of African American, and some of them are Native American soldiers from Maine who served in segregated units from other states or in various units. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to move the screen and see to not have the thing talking at me while I'm looking at what I've written here. Or in various units of the United States Colored Troops, the USCT. In general, and this is going to become important in the next, what I'm going to tell you next, African Americans weren't allowed to serve as soldiers. They were allowed to serve as laborers, but not as soldiers until, well, there's some pushback from, there's some initial organizing. Tim, you should talk about this part. In terms of soldiers and the Emancipation Proclamation and before that. But most of the Maine, you can all see the slide. So most of the African-American soldiers from Maine that they have the applications for, essentially when you signed up, were signed up with the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, which became the 11th U.S. Colored Troops Regiment. And those soldiers were first mustered in on August 28th of 1863. Even in these regiments, the soldiers were often fighting for as much in the North as they were against the South. They were fighting for equal pay, they were fighting for equal standing, they were fighting indeed for the right to fight as soldiers and not just be laborers. They were not granted equal pay until by Congress until 1865, actually after the war, although it was back pay.
So I'll jump in here for a second. Brenda mentioned earlier the difficulty in assigning motivation or such to the stuff that happened 150 years ago. Clearly that's, very difficult for us to do. I would say there's another issue here of terminology. Even between Brenda and I, we've had a few little moments over whether or not I should refer to these people as colored troops or not, which was the terminology at the time, versus black or African American, or the acceptable terminology of today. But I would note that in the period they were referred to as colored troops, although we're going to come back to how that's kind of a blanket misnomer as well, because in certain muster, it's the documentation that Brenda was referring to moments ago, particularly early on in the war, everyone's complexion was listed. And a lot of times you were either light or maybe sandy or dark complected. So that was true of white troops as well as colored troops. So it's an interesting, and your eye color was listed as light, dark, or something. Sometimes they would list a color, but usually it was either light or dark. Because the forms were very simple. But the other thing about the pay, just so you have an idea, a Union soldier was paid $13 a month when they were paid at all, and that's a whole different question. When the colored regiments, black regiments, began to be enlisted, originally they were told they'd be paid the same. But quickly that became not really, we're going to pay $7 a month. And if those of you who maybe have seen the movie Glory, about the 54th Massachusetts, they have a couple of scenes in there where they discuss the pay issue and the soldiers' protest and the white officers' protest. The movie gets that largely correct in spirit, if not totally accurately in fact. But the 54th Massachusetts, they did in fact protest, and the white officers did in fact protest the pay issue, since they were being paid more. And that's another thing we should point out. All of these African American regiments, there were only white officers. Some of the non-commissioned officers, the corporals and sergeants, those might have been colored, black individuals. And toward the very close of the war, there were a few black officers that gained real commissions, lieutenant and above. But I would say 99% of the officers of these black regiments were whites. That's just the way the Army decided it was going to be done.
So the next question you might have might have is, how did that actually play out in Maine? So in doing research on this, I ran across a letter in the Maine State Archive files from September of 1862. So remember, we just talked about how African-American soldiers were not accepted at all, generally until 1863 at the earliest. So in September of 1862, Horatio Page, the selectman from Norridgewock, writes to the adjutant general, the person who's in charge of raising the troops in Maine, after two of the people that they had submitted, the Williams brothers, had been rejected for service. And I'm going to read you parts of this because it's quite striking. So he receives notice from Colonel Richter that 2 of our men are discharged on account of color, I suppose. So he says that these are men who wish to enlist, who've been in our town schools as other boys, have sustained as fair a reputation as an average of our young men, and all our other boys are willing to associate with them. And they seemed anxious to serve the country if they would be received. I think you will well remember that you said that they would be received. And at this time I learned that 2 of them are dismissed. And the underline is from the letter. You can see it here. And then he goes on to say, and whether we can get more men without a draft, if such men as those cannot find a place in the Army of Maine, men who can fight, who have had experience in tending horses and driving teams and almost any kind of labor. If after all the government chooses to be without these men, I think they ought not to ask us to fill their places with others. Will you, dear sir, confer with the governor if necessary and let us know the result in haste. There is no response to this letter in the files, but this is 1862. And these are the Williams brothers. There's actually 3 of them. Their father, Miles Williams, is a physician. And Anthony, Aaron, and Andrew J. in 1850, this is the 1850 census, are all listed here. Their mother had died the year before. And hang on, I have to click this part over here. Or no, not the year before, a few years before. So this is a listing from the history of Norridgewock, from a record kept by Reverend Pete. And maybe this reflects Reverend Pete's racism, bias, lack of interest. But you'll notice that when you look at these list of names, you know, most people have names and ages, but the wife of Miles Williams is just the wife of Miles Williams, who's colored. She was actually white, according to the 1830 census anyway. And in 1831, 2 persons of color in his family die of unknown ages. So they're not specified. So perhaps Horatio Page viewed these young men as just like all our other boys, but maybe they weren't really being viewed as all those, just quite as equal as all those other boys by everybody in the community. It's complicated, is what I've learned. Quite complicated.
And you can see from the excerpt of the census that Miles Williams is Black and all the kids are mulatto because his wife was white, and therefore the kids can't be Black. But that, of course, was left up to the census taker as to how to list the color or race of the people on the census in that period. In fact, I've seen people go from being Black in one census, to mulatto in another census, to white in yet the third census. So it's all about, again, those motivations we can't exactly, discern a century and a half later.
So what happens to these boys who want to join and who have been rejected? So these young men. So really, we're going to get to back here in a second, I promise. So here's Anthony, Aaron, and Andrew Williams. And between the three of them, they kind of cover the gamut of all the different ways in which African-American men in Maine dealt with enrolling in and fighting in the Civil War. So the first one who signs up here is actually Anthony. He enlists in November, and he signs up. He's described here. You'll see his on this card that reflects what he reported on his, how he was described when he was mustered in. He's described as dark, eyes are black, his hair is black, and he's a farmer. He enrolls in the 30th Maine in Company D. So he is not explicitly being called black. He's essentially serving as white. He is not counted in any of those statistics. That 92 and 104 people that we talked about, he's not counted there. Then you have Andrew J. Andrew J is the youngest of the three, and he signs up, actually, I take it back. He signs up first on the 15th of November. And when he talks to the recruiter, he ends up signing up to join up with the 14th Rhode Island. Let's see if I can, I don't know if I can zoom into this at all here. But he is described as having black complexion. The third brother, Aaron, in the middle of his, he's in middle in age, is the one that carries through to our story because he joins the First Maine Heavy Artillery. He signs up on the 26th of December, 1863. And he is described as African American. He's described as black, as having a black complexion, and specifically as a mulatto. Within the space of a couple of months, each of these three brothers has taken a different approach, or their recruiters have taken a different approach to how they're going to get these young men in the Army and serving to fill the quotas of their various towns.
All right, so I'm going to talk just a moment about this quota concept again. So when the federal government assigns quotas to the states, they do it based on the populations of the states in general. And so populous states like Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York is going to have a higher quota than somewhere like Maine. But the fact of the matter is that there's only so many males in each state, and so filling those quotas as the war goes on becomes more and more of a challenge, and they start having to talk about drafting people. Because even the quotas are not, you're getting you see all of these documents say volunteer enlistment at the top. These are not, this is not the World War I or World War II draft where they call everybody up of a certain age. That comes later. But you're looking for volunteers to go into the service to go off and have the grand adventure. So, but there are, as Union forces go out into Southern territory, they start to encounter blacks. And what happens almost immediately is the government has to deal with it, because Union commanders in various locations are saying, well, I'd love to put these essentially escaped slaves to use so that, you know, I can do something with them rather than just having them loiter behind my lines. And so they start to put together what they call contraband regiments in various places, some of which eventually become U.S. colored troop regiments. And so immediately the federal government is forced into dealing with this, and Lincoln, well, you know, on some level doesn't want to deal with it, and on other, because he does not want the border states to secede, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, those places. He wants them to stay in the Union and not become actual Confederate states. And so his policy is, nope, we're not going to list blacks as soldiers. That's just not what we're going to do. And in fact, federal law at the time would have prohibited that anyway. So it's not until the Emancipation Proclamation is issued and becomes effective on January 1st of 1863 that the states, the northern states, even think they have any chance at all of using colored or black people as soldiers. And so when the proclamation comes into effect in 1863 and Congress says you can start to use colored black troops, well, then the 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments are raised, and states all across the North start to raise, or at least think about raising, colored regiments. Now, Maine, we just don't have that many colored black people in the state at the time. What we do have, the few that we did have, weren't enough to create a regiment. And so this is why a lot of these guys get sent off into the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery. Rhode Island didn't have enough colored troops either, or enough black troops to form a regiment either. So they were casting far and wide to find the individuals needed to fill up the ranks of the unit. So that's why a number of these guys from Maine end up in that unit. However, there were a few left over. A few blacks, that is, left over, and some went into other units.
But again, it's extremely difficult to understand all of what happened here. There are some interesting commonalities. So this next slide here is the 3 men from Bath, or at least they're all assigned to the quota of Bath. It's fairly clear that Franklin Fremont and George Augustus Freeman actually lived in Bath. I'm not sure that Lemuel Carter did at the time. He was actually from Yarmouth and ended up living in Brunswick, but they all are attributed to Bath's quota. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Well, the little we know about them. Franklin Fremont is born in Lexington, Missouri, unless he was actually born in Louisiana or Georgia or Virginia, which various censuses say he was born in, but most consistently he says he was born in Lexington, Missouri. He's in Bath before the war, and he marries in Bath after the war. but he then moves to Massachusetts, and we'll actually talk about that a little more later. And he signs up on the 4th of January. The person who recruited him is listed on his documentation as Samuel L. Allen of Bath. And you'll see that the signature here on each of these is John S. Baker, who is also of Bath, and who serves as the local, well, Tim can explain the military term of it.
He's one of the provost marshals in Maine, and he's the provost marshal for the 18th Maine Volunteer Infantry, which is going to become the First Maine Heavy Artillery. And the provost marshal is one of those, it's not really a rank, it's a duty or a position where you are in charge of gathering up the soldiers, enlisting them, and maintaining the records, and dealing with disciplinary duty within the regiments and that sort of thing. It's a sort of thing that you don't necessarily leave the state. You might end up always being in Maine and not necessarily being, there might be somebody acting as provost marshal with the regiment when it goes into the field, but you might also just always be within the state.
So the first person who signs up is actually George Freeman, on January 1st, but he doesn't actually sign the paperwork until the 5th, because he comes back with his brother-in-law, Lemuel Carter. Lemuel Carter's married to George Augustus Freeman's sister, Susan. What is especially interesting about George Augustus Freeman in particular is that he has some deep roots in Bath, in that his grandfather was a Revolutionary War soldier. His grandfather, John Freeman, and who moved to Bath shortly after the Bath area shortly after the Revolutionary War, and applied for his Revolutionary War pension from Bath. So we found his pension documents. So this is a multi-generational, family who's lived in this area in East Brunswick and in North Bath for several generations now. And where there's a tradition of military service. I thought that was really interesting. But all three of these men were recruited by Samuel Allen, who, after the war, well, he also has served in 61 to 62. He's actually just been in the service, and he comes back and he recruits other soldiers. He ends up actually running the poorhouse in Bath. So he's an interesting character. But what we really don't know is sort of who decided or how, whether it was because Samuel Allen pushed, because he'd recruited these three men into the unit in the same way that the selectmen from Norwalk had been indignant because he had, gone and recruited these people, and then they were being, and he promised them they were going to be able to serve, and then they weren't able to serve. We don't know if it was the recruiter who brought all these three men who said, no, I want them all to serve together, and the unit I, signed them up for, and Baker went along with it. We don't know if it was because the law was changing, or maybe it was these men's choice. Maybe they had the choice to go into the 14th Rhode Island or into this First Maine Heavy Artillery and wanted to stick with the people that they knew. It's difficult to say. But they are, all four of them, Aaron Williams and these three men, are all described in the regimental history for the First Maine Artillery as being of African descent and as serving in the unit. So it was very clear. These are actually two of George Freeman's cousins who also served in the Civil War. And you'll see that both of them, well, Moses Freeman, they're brothers. Moses Freeman signs up around the same time. He signs up in November of 63. 63? Yeah, 63. Albion KP Freeman signs up in July. So that's before the 14th Maine had been filled. But in any case, these two men who are George's cousins, again, were described by the recruiter or by themselves as dark complexion and are essentially serving under the radar. But when I was reading, there's a genealogy that's published of the Freeman, that was published of the Freeman family in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. And I kept, going through it going, here's another Civil War veteran. Here's another Civil War veteran. There was 3 or 4 or 5 people in the family who, had Revolutionary service or Civil War service. So it was very striking. Because for the most part, their story isn't told because they're not counted. So Tim's going to tell you a little bit about what happened to them what happened to the First Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment and what happened to these men.
So as the regiment is raised, it's raised as the 18th Maine Volunteer Infantry in 1862 in the greater Bangor area and Penobscot Bay and points east. They are very quickly assigned to the defenses of Washington when the infantry regiment is mustered in, about 1,000 men, and they are sent down to Washington, D.C., and they end up in a couple of small forts on the Confederate side or Virginia side of the Potomac River around Alexandria. The inset photo at the top is supposed to be Captain Crosman's Company H, but it's labeled Company D, serving heavy artillery at one of the forts. So they're technically an infantry regiment, but they're being trained on these large caliber field guns. And they spend a large portion of the war, well, some soldiers probably would have said living the good life. Others probably would have said bored to tears. So on August 24th of 1862, they go off to D.C. Colonel Daniel Chaplin, the other photograph, a Bangor businessman, is in command of the regiment. And then they spend, as I said, most of the war drilling, trying to avoid disease, building fortifications, cutting down trees, a lot of stuff they were familiar with. It is said of their regiment actually that they have some of the best.
You want to listen? Or
Yeah.
Some of the best quarters because they know how to build stuff from you know, just raw lumber, and they build like they would have built if they were in a lumber camp in the Maine woods. But they miss all of the major campaigns of the Army of the Potomac: Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. Then the 1864 rolls around. Ulysses S. Grant is made commander of all of the armies, of Union armies, and comes to the east. So on January 6th of 1863, all these regiments in the defenses of Washington are redesignated as heavy artillery, which was kind of new. And they were given 2 additional companies in January and February of 1864, L and M. And the companies are made a little bit bigger, which makes the regiment bigger. So they're about 1,400 men altogether. And the soldiers of our interest, Carter, Freeman, and Fremont, are all in Company M. And those companies were not raised specifically in Bangor, but they were raised throughout all of Maine, which is how our guys from Bath end up in this regiment. They would have gotten new uniforms and new standard at that time. The infantry standard would have been blue. The regimental standard for the heavy artillery was kind of, it looks tan there, but it's actually yellow, with the red banners, and the cross cannons are painted in gold leaf on the silk standards. And then Grant goes off and starts fighting what they call the Overland Campaign, and at the Battle of the Wilderness, the Army of the Potomac suffers about 17,500 casualties. So Grant needs replacements, and he turns to the staff and says, hey, you got all those lovely regiments standing around in Washington, D.C. doing nothing. Send 10,000 of them down to me. And so a heavy artillery regiment, or heavy artillery division under General R.M. Tyler is created, Tyler's Heavy Artillery Division, and sent to the Army of the Potomac, just in time for the very final act of the Battle of Spotsylvania at Harris's farm. Although it's got different names depending on whose reports you look at. So they get down there, and at the time, the Army of the Potomac is trying to shift to the south, and they are kind of left on the northern flank of the army, just at the moment where Robert E. Lee orders one of his corps commanders, Richard Ewell, to make an attack or make a reconnaissance to find out what the Union Army is doing. And the only people who happen to be in the way is this brand new, totally untried division of heavy artillerists. Mm-hmm. As you can see from the map, the First Maine is kind of on the right-hand end in front of Alsop's farm, kind of in the middle of the line there. That map is a little late in the action. They were actually kind of all by their lonesome for a moment. And they went into the fight with approximately, about 1,400 men, and they lose 82 killed in action and 394 wounded, and 5 missing in their first action. Now that might sound horrific, and of course it is. It's not unusual. What they would call green or untried veteran units tend to stand around and take a lot of abuse. And they weren't untrained. They'd been drilling for the better part of a year in infantry tactics. They started as an infantry regiment. They knew what they were doing. They just hadn't done it in practice. But they stood up against veteran Confederates of the Army of Northern Virginia. And in fact, Grant is quoted later as saying in his memoirs that these artillery troops fought with the steadiness of veterans. I won't go through the whole quote because he goes on for quite a while, but he gave them props for standing up and taking it and driving off the Confederate attack. And here George Freeman is shot in the hand and the foot. And then, as part of the Army of the Potomac, they're going to participate in some of the follow-up actions of the Overland Campaign, most notably Petersburg, where they are going to earn a, well, unfortunate record, if you will, of being the unit that sustains the highest casualty rate in any single action of any Union unit in the war, when they are ordered into an attack at Petersburg early on in the Petersburg, well, not really before the siege begins, and the rest of the regiments in their brigade, the artillery division has been broken up and they've been spread out into other brigades at this point. But the rest of the regiment, veteran units, looks at the situation and says, yeah, we're not going forward. But Colonel Chaplin and the First Maine Heavy Artillery says, well, we were ordered to do this, so we're going to do it. 900 men step off in the First Maine at that point, First Maine Heavy Artillery. About 10 minutes later, according to the regimental history, 632 of them are dead on the field or severely wounded and not in the ranks. And when the rest of the regiment gets back from this horrific attack that they make across open ground against well-entrenched Confederates, they have fewer than 200 effectives left. And they're missing a bunch of officers, and somehow miraculously Colonel Chaplin is not wounded, but they do claim that he was a broken man, that when they got back to the cover of where they started from, he just sat down, propped up on his sword, and cried like a baby. Understandably so. The pencil sketch here at the top of this slide is what they faced when they made the attack. They would have been attacking from the kind of bottom of the image right up that road toward the hills in the background, a little bit left of what is listed there as Petersburg, taking fire from not only the front of them where the Confederates are dug in on that little wooded hill where there's a cemetery, but also from across and to the right from across the Appomattox where the Confederates had artillery batteries on the raised ground over there on the other side of the Appomattox River. And then the remains of the regiment holds itself together and participates in the siege of Petersburg from June of '64 to April of 1865. The notable one would be on August 17th, when they're actually north of the James River at an incident referred to as the Second Battle of Deep Bottom, where Colonel Chaplin is forward in doing reconnaissance forward up with the skirmishers and is shot by a Confederate sniper, and then dies, shot in the lung, and dies a couple days later in a hospital in Philadelphia. There's some really interesting in the regimental history. The brigade commander, Philip Trobriand, who's of French ancestry, as actually French, talks about describing his impression of Chaplin when he meets him. He knows that Chaplin's going to die, and he goes on in the history describing these things he observes about Chaplin and Chaplin's soul and these different mannerisms and such. If you read them to me, de Trobriand is clearly describing post-traumatic stress syndrome, or what we'd call it today. And some people say, or some of the accounts from some of the soldiers definitely describe Colonel Chaplin as maybe looking knowing that he's going to die, and in some ways maybe looking for it to come find him, which is not at all an uncommon story in the Civil War or later wars, for that matter, when guys are subjected to these severely traumatic events. And then around September of 65, Lee's army is on its last ropes. The First Maine Heavy Artillery is detached from the Army of the Potomac and ordered back to Bangor, where they are ultimately mustered out of federal service in mid-September.
So I want to go back for a second and point out what's happened to our guys. So back here before they even leave Washington. All right, sorry. Before they even leave Washington, Lemuel Carter doesn't go with them because he's sick. He's discharged in August for disability in August of 1864. Tim mentioned George Freeman is shot. He's in hospital until he's discharged in December of 1864. Aaron Williams, the young man from Norwich Walk, is shot in the arm in the Battle of Petersburg, in the charge at Petersburg, and he's reported as wounded through September. He later dies in the camp at Petersburg. The reported cause is disease. The regimental history attributes his death to overwork. So we're almost done here. This is what happened to each of them after they left. So after the war, Franklin Fremont is mustered out. He's mustered out earlier than the other guys because they basically start sending out, discharging early people who are disabled or who are not serving on the front lines. And it's unclear what happens to him. His discharge paper says that he's still owed $120 of his bonus, and that he's being sent home from the Harewood Hospital in Washington, but there's no record of an injury or sickness. It also notes that he's last paid by his regiment at the end of December. So it's not clear what happened to him between the end of December of 64 and April of 65, although I'll note that he marries Carolyn Hill in Bath in March of 1865, so he might have been home before he even mustered out. But as I said earlier, he moved to Massachusetts. Lemuel Carter is mustered out in August. Because he never made it into the battlefield with people. He lives in Brunswick after the war with his wife, Susan Freeman, and he works as a hostler for the Tontine Hotel. Charles M. Carter, who's his half-brother, lives in Bath and works as a hostler in Bath and until his death in 1886. So he remains connected to Bath, even though he lives in Brunswick after the war. He's buried in Yarmouth. And finally, George Augustus Freeman is discharged for disability in December of 1864, and he returns to Bath. He is recorded in the city directories and the census records as a laborer. I note his marriage here because in the course of doing this research, we discovered that Tim is related to his third wife here, Mrs. Sarah Talbot, maiden name Talbot, Watson, who George Freeman marries at this point. So in fact, Tim is related by marriage to George Augustus Freeman.
It's a small world.
And it's about like a fifth cousin once removed, but Karen would have to tell me for sure. But it's quite a ways back, but it was a really interesting tidbit to find out. So in these newspaper clippings showed George Freeman is in fact a constable. He's in 1886. He's named as one of the constables in Bath. And there's the notice of his death that appeared in the Bath Independent in 1887. He's buried in Bath. And that's it. That's the beginning of what we know. There's a lot more to find out. There's definitely books in this story, but
Well, thank you so much. I will stop the recording now, and we have just a few minutes for questions.
sorry.
No, there's so much to discuss, and
So much.
I'm really floored by how much you were able to do on this in such a short time and during a pandemic. So excellent presentation. Who would like to speak up with a question as I stop the recording?